Gunnison County, Colorado Territory. October 1878. At 9,000 feet elevation, where autumn frosts arrive in September and winter doesn't release its grip until May, a solitary figure worked against the approaching cold. Ezra Callahan, former railroad surveyor turned mountain man, was building something his neighbors called madness. Two chimneys, side by side, connected at their base. Man can barely afford the stone for one chimney, and he's building two, muttered Samuel Hedricks, a homesteader who'd survived 8 Colorado winters. He'll be out of firewood by January and frozen by February. The other settlers agreed. In a land where every rock had to be hauled, every log split by hand, and every BTU of heat desperately hoarded, Callahan's design seemed like the fever dream of a man who'd spent too many nights alone in the high country. But here's what they didn't know. Ezra Callahan had spent 3 years surveying railroad routes through the Rockies. He'd slept in Ute winter shelters. He'd measured temperature differentials in mining camps from Leadville to Silverton. And he'd asked himself one question that none of his neighbors had ever considered. What if the problem isn't how much heat you make, but how much heat you waste? Before we reveal what Ezra understood that experienced frontiersmen missed, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what you're about to learn might just change how you think about heating forever. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why 13 cabins copied his design within 18 months. The question that haunted the valley that autumn was simple. Was Ezra Callahan a genius or a fool? Winter would answer. In the Colorado high country of the 1870s, cabin construction followed iron rules born from iron necessity. One room, one door facing south, one window if you could afford glass, and one chimney, built from whatever stone the land offered, positioned on the north wall to block the prevailing wind. These weren't suggestions. They were survival equations, refined through frostbite and failure. Ezra Callahan's design violated every one of them. When he laid out his foundation in late September, the pattern confused everyone who saw it. 2 parallel stone columns, each measuring 4 feet wide, positioned 8 feet apart on the cabin's western wall. Between them, a shared firebox opening that would feed both chimneys simultaneously. It's backwards, declared Marcus Webb, a stonemason who'd built 17 cabins across the valley. Chimney goes on the north wall, always. Blocks the wind. Ezra's got his facing the prevailing weather. He'll have downdrafts so bad he won't be able to keep a flame lit. But the positioning wasn't what drew the harshest criticism. It was the sheer excess of the design. Each chimney required approximately 2,400 pounds of sandstone. Callahan was committing to moving, shaping, and mortaring 4,800 pounds of rock. The nearest quarry sat 3 miles down the mountain. Every stone would travel that distance on a hand-built sled pulled by his single mule. He's doing the work of building 2 cabins just to heat one, observed Sarah Penfield, whose husband had helped Callahan roof his structure. And for what? So he could burn twice the wood. The whispered consensus around evening fires was darker. Ezra Callahan was lonely, possibly unhinged, and certainly building something that would collapse under its first heavy snow or choke on its own smoke. Only one man asked Callahan directly about his reasoning. James Torrance, a younger homesteader from Missouri, found Ezra measuring angles with a homemade plumb line in early October. "Why 2?" he asked simply. Callahan didn't look up from his work. "Fire makes heat 2 ways, James. Flame and stone. Everybody chases the flame. I'm banking on the stone." Torrance waited for more, but Callahan just returned to his measurements, checking the angle between the 2 chimney foundations with an intensity that seemed excessive for simple stonework. The phrase circulated through the settlement. Banking on the stone. It sounded poetic. It sounded foolish. November arrived with early snow, and Ezra Callahan's double chimneys rose toward the sky like a monument to stubbornness. Each column stood 16 feet tall, their dark sandstone surfaces already dusted with white. Marcus Webb made his final assessment as the first serious cold settled in. Beautiful stonework. Completely useless. Man's going to learn a hard lesson this winter. What Ezra Callahan understood, and what his neighbors couldn't see, was a principle that wouldn't have a formal name for another 40 years: thermal mass storage. The standard frontier chimney of the 1870s was built for one purpose: get the smoke out. Stone was selected for availability and durability, not heat retention. Most chimneys were built as thin as safety allowed, typically 18 to 24 inches thick, to conserve labor and materials. Callahan's chimneys were 48 inches thick, 4 feet of solid sandstone. He'd chosen sandstone deliberately. During his railroad surveys, he'd noticed something the engineers hadn't cared about. The rocks around certain mining camps stayed warm long after the fires went cold. He'd put his hand on limestone, granite, and sandstone after identical heating periods. Sandstone held heat longest. The reason, though Callahan didn't know the modern terminology, was specific heat capacity. Sandstone's crystalline structure absorbed thermal energy more efficiently than most other common building stones and released it slowly over time. But the dual chimney design wasn't just about mass. It was about circulation. The two chimneys shared a single, enlarged firebox at their base, measuring 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep. This firebox opened into both chimney flues simultaneously. When fire burned, hot gases rose through both columns, heating 4,800 pounds of stone from the inside. Here's where Callahan's design became brilliant. The twin chimneys created a convection loop. As the stone heated, it radiated warmth into the cabin. The air closest to the hot stone rose, creating a gentle circulation pattern. Cool air from the floor was drawn toward the chimney base, warmed, and rose again. Unlike a standard fireplace where heat went straight up and out, Callahan's system trapped thermal energy in the stone mass and released it gradually through radiation. He claimed the system would hold heat for 6 to 8 hours after the fire died completely. Marcus Webb, the stonemason, called this claim Highland superstition dressed up as engineering. Stone doesn't make heat, Webb explained to a gathering of settlers in November. Fire makes heat. Stone just sits there. You can build it thick as a fort wall, and it won't add 1 degree of warmth. All Callahan's done is waste labor on extra stone that'll pull heat away from his fire faster, cool his cabin quicker, and leave him burning wood all night just to stay alive. Webb's logic seemed sound. After all, everyone knew that stone was cold. You didn't sleep on stone in winter. You slept on wood or straw. Stone pulled heat from your body. Therefore, more stone meant more cold. The error in this reasoning was subtle. Webb was confusing conduction with radiation. Stone in direct contact with skin does conduct heat away from the body quickly. But heated stone in open air radiates energy outward in all directions, warming everything around it without physical contact. Callahan tried to explain this once, in his quiet way. It's not about touching the stone. It's about standing near it, like standing near a sun-warmed boulder at dusk. The comparison made settlers smile. Poetic, they thought. Impractical. By late November, with construction complete, Ezra Callahan had burned through 4 months of labor, 3 months of mule-driving stone transport, and the goodwill of neighbors who'd initially offered help but gradually drifted away, convinced they were watching a man build his own frozen tomb. The chimney stood 16 feet tall, 8 feet apart, joined at their base by the massive shared firebox. Total weight of stone, approximately 4,800 pounds. Interior cabin space, consumed by the structure, 32 square feet, nearly a quarter of his single-room dwelling. First snow had already fallen 3 times. Temperature had dropped below freezing 12 nights in a row. And Ezra Callahan, methodical as always, began his first fire in the double chimney system on November 28, 1878. He burned it for exactly 4 hours, then let it die completely. Then he waited, hand on the stone, counting. The construction had begun on September 22, 1878, the day after the autumn equinox. Ezra Callahan knew he had perhaps 8 weeks before serious cold made masonry work dangerous. Wet mortar freezes. Frozen mortar crumbles. A chimney built in freezing conditions isn't a chimney. It's a pile of rocks waiting to collapse. The foundation came first. Callahan dug 2 parallel trenches, each 5 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, down to bedrock. The depth raised eyebrows. Standard chimney foundations in the territory ran 18 to 24 inches. Callahan was going twice as deep. Foundation for a church bell tower, observed Samuel Hedricks, watching from a distance. For a cabin chimney, it's lunacy. But Callahan had calculated the load. Each chimney would weigh approximately 2,400 pounds. The shared firebox foundation needed to support nearly 5,000 pounds of stone plus the lateral stress of thermal expansion and contraction through temperature swings of 100 degrees or more. Shallow foundations crack. Cracked chimneys leak smoke and die. He filled the foundation trenches with river stones, packed tight and layered with a lime mortar mix he'd modified. 3 parts sand, 2 parts lime, 1 part wood ash from his clearing fires. The ash, he'd learned from a Ute elder, made mortar more resistant to freeze-thaw cycles. Foundation work consumed 12 days. The stone hauling began October 5th. Callahan had identified a sandstone outcrop 3 miles south where weathering had fractured the rock into manageable pieces. Each trip with his mule-drawn sled brought approximately 400 pounds of stone. He needed 12 trips for the foundation and base, another 20 for the chimney columns themselves. 20 trips, 3 miles each way, with a mule named Constance who'd already worked a full career pulling railroad equipment. James Torrance, the young Missouri homesteader, helped with 7 of those trips. He later told others, Ezra didn't just grab any stone. He'd test each piece, tap it with a hammer, listen to the ring, check for cracks I couldn't even see. Rejected maybe 1 stone in 4. Said if stone has a flaw, heat will find it. The chimneys rose slowly through October. Each course of stone required careful fitting. Callahan used large, flat sandstone pieces for the outer faces, filling the interior with smaller stones and mortar. The result was a solid mass, not a hollow shell with a rubble core like many frontier chimneys. Every 4th course, he laid stones that projected 2 inches into the cabin interior. These corbels would radiate additional heat into the living space and provide structural ties between the inner and outer stone faces. By October 28th, both chimneys had reached 8 feet in height. The shared firebox was complete, its opening carefully shaped to create smooth airflow into both flues. Then the weather turned. November arrived with a cold snap. Temperature dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit on November 3rd. Callahan worked faster, mixing mortar in smaller batches to prevent freezing, keeping water buckets near his small construction fire. Marcus Webb stopped by on November 7th, ostensibly to borrow an auger bit, actually to assess the work. He ran his hand along the stonework, checked the mortar joints, peered up the flues. Craftsmanship solid, Webb admitted. Mortar's clean, stones well fitted. Of course, it's all in service of a design that won't work, but at least it won't fall down. Callahan was positioning a capstone. He didn't respond. Webb tried again. Ezra, it's not too late. You could cap one of these chimneys, convert the other to standard firebox. Save yourself the wood you'll waste feeding 2 flues. Not 2 flues, Callahan said quietly. 1 system. Webb left shaking his head. The chimneys were completed November 19th. Total height, 16 feet from foundation to cap. Each chimney's interior flue measured 12 inches by 12 inches. The shared firebox below could accommodate logs up to 4 feet in length. First snow of substance fell November 23rd, 6 inches overnight, temperature dropping to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The settlement watched Callahan's cabin, waiting for the inevitable. Smoke should appear any day now as he started burning wood to stay alive. They expected to see 2 columns of smoke, proof that he was indeed feeding 2 separate fires, wasting precious fuel. What they didn't expect was what actually happened. Callahan burned his first fire on November 28th. 4 hours, medium intensity, using approximately 30 pounds of split pine and aspen. Smoke rose from both chimneys, as expected. Then, at 2 p.m., the smoke stopped, completely, from both chimneys, and didn't resume until the next morning. Samuel Hedricks noticed it first. Either he let his fire die and he's freezing in there, or he trailed off because there was no, or that made sense. The temperature that night dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Ezra Callahan's cabin showed no smoke from dusk until dawn. In the morning, when James Torrance rode past, he saw Callahan outside without a heavy coat, splitting wood in the weak winter sun. "You make it through the night," Torrance called, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. 62 degrees inside when I woke up," Callahan replied. "Stone's still warm to the touch." Torrance rode back to the settlement and reported this. No one believed him. The real test came exactly 6 weeks later, on a date that would be remembered in Gunnison County records as one of the coldest nights in settlement history. January 9th, 1879. The cold front arrived without warning. Temperature at dawn, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, -8 degrees Fahrenheit and still falling. Samuel Hendricks loaded his firebox at 4 p.m. and didn't let the fire drop below a strong burn all evening. His cabin, typical of valley construction, measured 16 by 20 feet with a standard north wall chimney, 24 inches thick, built from local granite. By 8 p.m., external temperature had reached -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Hendricks was burning wood as fast as he could split it, feeding logs every 40 minutes. Interior temperature near the fire, approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit. In the corners, away from direct heat, cold enough to see breath. He wasn't alone. Across the valley, every cabin showed smoke. Constant, thick smoke as settlers burned through their wood piles, fighting the cold. Every cabin except one. Ezra Callahan had lit his fire at 3 p.m. for hours of burning, just as he'd done since November. At 7 p.m., he let it die. James Torrance, worried about the older man, rode up the mountain at dusk. He found Callahan sitting at his table, shirt sleeves rolled up, writing in a journal by lamplight. "Ezra, it's going 20 below tonight. You need to keep that fire going." Callahan looked up. "Touch the stone, James." Torrance put his palm against the eastern chimney. The sandstone was hot. Not warm, hot. Uncomfortable to hold for more than a few seconds. "Fire's been dead for 90 minutes, Callahan said. "Stone's still climbing in temperature. Won't peak for another hour." He showed Torrance's journal. Neat columns of numbers. Time, external temperature estimates, internal temperature measurements taken with a mercury thermometer he'd bought in Denver, wood consumption. 3 logs this morning. 4 logs this afternoon. That's it. 7 logs total, about 35 pounds of wood. Callahan tapped the page. Samuel Hendricks burns that much in 3 hours on a night like this. Torrance looked around the cabin. Every corner felt warm. Not hot, but genuinely, evenly warm. The temperature differential between the area near the chimneys and the far corner of the cabin was minimal. "Ow!" Torrance asked. Callahan walked him through it. The massive stone mass absorbed heat during the burn. After the fire died, the stone, now superheated throughout its 4,800-pound bulk, began radiating that energy into the cabin. The dual-chimney design created circulation, warm air rising along the hot stone, cool air drawn in to replace it, a gentle convection loop that distributed heat evenly. Peak radiation happens about 90 minutes after the fire dies, Callahan explained. Stone needs time to equalize its internal temperature. Then it starts releasing it. Slowly. 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours on a cold night. At 10 p.m., when Torrance finally left, Callahan's cabin registered 58 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer. Outside, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. A differential of 80 degrees, maintained without active fire. Torrance rode home, checked his own cabin. Fire roaring, interior at 44 degrees Fahrenheit, wood pile visibly diminished, and made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd ask Callahan for the exact measurements of that chimney system. But first, he needed to tell Marcus Webb. The stonemason needed to see this. January 10th dawned at -24 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest morning in 3 years. Smoke poured from every chimney in the valley as families burned through wood reserves, fighting cold that could kill in minutes without shelter. Except from Ezra Callahan's cabin, where thin smoke appeared at 7 a.m., burned for 4 hours, and stopped completely by 11 a.m. Marcus Webb made the ride up the mountain that afternoon, Torrance beside him. What they found changed everything. Marcus Webb entered Ezra Callahan's cabin at 2 p.m. on January 10th, 1879, expecting to find a man huddled near a struggling fire, burning wood desperately to stay alive. Instead, he found Callahan at his workbench, planing wood for furniture, wearing a single wool shirt. The mercury thermometer hanging on the center wall read 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature was 20 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Webb stood silent for a full minute, his experienced mason's eye scanning the room. No active fire. The firebox showed only gray ash and the faint glow of buried coals from a fire that had clearly died hours ago. No other heat source. Just two massive sandstone columns radiating warmth like summer boulders at dusk. He walked to the eastern chimney and placed both palms against the stone. Heat pulsed against his skin. Deep, sustained heat that seemed to come from within the stone itself rather than from any surface flame. Fire went out at 11, Callahan said, not looking up from his work. Stone's still releasing. Won't drop below 50 degrees in here until sometime after dark. I'll burn another 4 hours tonight, 8 to midnight. That'll carry me through to morning. Webb did the mathematics in his head. 4 hours morning, 4 hours evening. 8 hours of burning per day. His own cabin required fire maintenance every 2 hours, 16 to 18 hours of active burning to maintain barely tolerable temperatures. Callahan was achieving superior warmth with half the burn time. How much wood? Webb asked. Callahan retrieved his journal. Yesterday, 42 pounds. Day before, 38 pounds. Today will run about 40, accounting for the extreme cold. Webb burned 80 to 90 pounds on a normal winter day. On a day like yesterday, he'd gone through nearly 120 pounds, keeping his family from freezing. The differential was impossible. And yet the evidence surrounded him. A warm cabin, a dead fire, and stone that radiated heat hours after the flame had died. James Torrance, who'd been standing quietly near the door, spoke up. Marcus, put your hand here. He gestured to the stone near the floor. Webb knelt and touched the base of the western chimney. Still warm. Not as hot as the upper sections, but noticeably warmer than the ambient air. Whole mass heats through, Callahan explained. Fire heats the flue from inside. Heat conducts through the stone. 4 feet of solid sandstone, almost 5,000 pounds of it, all absorbing energy. Then it releases slow, all day, all night, just radiating. Webb stood, processing. He'd built chimneys for 20 years. He'd never considered them as anything but smoke conduits. The idea that the chimney itself could be the primary heat source, that the fire was merely the mechanism to charge the stone battery. It inverted everything he thought he knew. The dual columns, Webb said slowly, working it through. They create circulation. Convection loop, Callahan confirmed. Hot air rises along the stones, pulls cool air from the floor. Room stays even. No cold corners. Webb walked the cabin's perimeter. Callahan was right. In Webb's own cabin, the area near the fire was tolerable, but the corners were brutal. Here, the temperature variation was minimal. The whole space felt evenly heated. What's the internal temperature difference? Webb asked. Fire burning versus fire out? Callahan flipped back through his journal. Peak temperature with fire burning, about 68 degrees. Low point, right before I start the evening fire, 48 to 52 degrees depending on outside cold. 12 to 16 hour cycle, 2 burns per day. Webb's cabin swung from 55 degrees near the fire to 35 in the corners, and that was with constant burning. The numbers were impossible. The numbers were real. Over the next week, as the January cold persisted, an informal experiment developed. Samuel Hedricks, Marcus Webb, and James Torrance began keeping their own journals, documenting wood consumption and interior temperatures. The results, compared over the 6-week period from January 9th through February 20th, told a clear story. Average daily wood consumption. Hedricks, standard granite chimney, 94 pounds. Webb, standard limestone chimney, 87 pounds. Torrance, standard sandstone chimney. Thin wall, 91 pounds. Callahan, dual sandstone chimney. Thermal mass, 41 pounds. Callahan was using 56% less wood than the settlement average. Average interior temperature during active burning Hedricks, 51 degrees Fahrenheit Webb, 48 degrees Fahrenheit Torrance, 53 degrees Fahrenheit Callahan, 66 degrees Fahrenheit average interior temperature, no active fire Hedricks, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, fire required every 2 to 3 hours to prevent dangerous cold, Webb, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, fire required every 2 to 3 hours, Torrance, 43 degrees Fahrenheit, fire required every 2 to 3 hours, Callahan, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, fire required only twice daily, 12-hour interval sustainable. The differential between Callahan's minimum temperature and the settlement average was 9 to 13 degrees, but the differential between his maximum temperature and theirs was 13 to 18 degrees. During the coldest night of the winter, February 3rd, when external temperature dropped to minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit, the contrast became stark. Hedricks burned wood continuously for 14 hours, maintaining interior temperature between 44 and 49 degrees. He consumed 156 pounds of wood and barely slept, feeding the fire every 90 minutes. Callahan burned 2 4-hour fires. Total wood consumption, 47 pounds. Interior temperature never dropped below 49 degrees. He slept 8 hours straight. The 34-degree differential in the title wasn't hyperbole. It was documented reality. Callahan's cabin at 54 degrees Fahrenheit internal versus February night external temperature at 20 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. But the real revolution wasn't in the numbers. It was in what the numbers meant. Every settler in Gunnison County spent the winter in a state of siege, feeding fires constantly, burning through its stockpiles, losing sleep to the 2-hour feeding cycle that defined frontier winter survival. Ezra Callahan spent the winter working on furniture, reading, and sleeping through the night. The difference wasn't comfort. It was freedom. Marcus Webb returned to Callahan's cabin on February 15th with a direct question. Will you share the exact specifications? Callahan handed him the journal. Full measurements, stone selection criteria, foundation depth, firebox dimensions, flue sizing, chimney spacing, everything. No secrets, Callahan said. Just physics and stone. The first conversion began on February 24th, 1879, the day James Torrance started demolishing his existing chimney. He couldn't afford to build a completely new structure like Callahan's, but he could modify what he had. Torrance's plan: thicken his existing sandstone chimney from 20 inches to 42 inches, add a secondary stone column 6 feet away, connected by a modified firebox, creating a smaller-scale version of Callahan's thermal mass system. Marcus Webb, his skepticism finally shattered by 6 weeks of empirical data, helped with the design and construction. The work took 3 weeks. They worked carefully, reinforcing the existing foundation, adding the new column, connecting the firebox while maintaining structural integrity. The risk was real. A poorly executed modification could result in smoke leakage, structural collapse, or worse. On March 18th, Torrance lit his first fire in the modified system. The results weren't as dramatic as Callahan's full dual chimney design, but they were significant. Wood consumption dropped by approximately 30%. Interior temperature increased by an average of 7 degrees. Heat retention after fire death extended from less than 2 hours to nearly 5. More importantly, Torrance could sleep through the night without feeding the fire. Word spread rapidly through the isolated mountain communities. By late April 1879, as winter finally released its grip, 3 more homesteaders had begun planning similar modifications for the following autumn. But the real transformation came from an unexpected source: Marcus Webb himself. The stonemason who'd publicly dismissed Callahan's design as Highland ignorance spent the spring of 1879 redesigning his approach to chimney construction. He incorporated Callahan's principles: thermal mass prioritization, stone selection for heat capacity, foundation depth for stability, and, for new construction, the dual column system. In May 1879, Webb built the settlement's first new cabin since Callahan's, incorporating a modified double chimney design. The homesteader, A recent arrival named Robert Hutchins was skeptical about the extra labor and cost. Webb made him a guarantee. If this chimney doesn't cut your wood use by at least a third and keep you warmer than any other cabin in this valley, I'll rebuild it to standard design at no charge. Hutchins agreed. The following winter, 1879 to 1880, Hutchins documented his results in letters to family back east. His cabin, slightly smaller than Callahan's at 14 by 18 feet, maintained interior temperatures between 58 and 64 degrees during active burning, dropping to 46 to 50 degrees overnight with no fire. Wood consumption, approximately 45 pounds per day during the coldest months. His neighbor, in a standard construction cabin of identical size, burned 89 pounds per day to achieve significantly lower temperatures. Hutchins' letters circulated. By the autumn of 1880, Marcus Webb had requests for 7 new double chimney systems from homesteaders across Gunnison County and neighboring Pitkin County. The technique spread through the practical demonstration that defined frontier knowledge transfer. One neighbor showing another what worked, backed by the undeniable evidence of a warm cabin and a full woodpile in February. By the spring of 1881, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius of Callahan's original construction incorporated thermal mass chimney designs. Not all were full dual-column systems. Some were single chimney modifications using extreme thickness, 36 to 48 inches, and careful stone selection. But all followed Callahan's core principle. The chimney wasn't just for smoke. It was the primary heating system. The social consequences rippled beyond heating efficiency. Families that previously spent winter in survival mode, every hour focused on fire maintenance, with splitting and simply staying alive, now had time for other activities. Children could study by lamplight without huddling inches from the fire. Women could work on crafts and preservation without numb fingers. Men could work on repairs and construction during winter months instead of simply burning wood and waiting for spring. The economic impact was equally significant. Reduced wood consumption meant smaller wood lots could sustain a household, freeing land for other uses. It also meant less time spent on the brutal labor of tree felling, hauling, and splitting, time that could be redirected to other productive work. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. Winter had always been a siege, a test of endurance, a season to survive, not to live. Callahan's chimneys transformed winter from an enemy to be fought into a season to be inhabited. The difference between sleeping in 2-hour shifts to feed a fire and sleeping 8 hours straight wasn't just comfort. It was human dignity. Sarah Penfield, the woman who'd initially mocked Callahan's construction as wasteful, wrote in her diary in January 1881, "Our new chimney, built last autumn by Mr. Webb following Mr. Callahan's design, has changed winter from a trial to be endured into a season like any other. John sleeps through the night. The children study their lessons without shivering. I can knit, and sew without my fingers going numb. This is not merely improvement. This is transformation." On March 3, 1881, the settlement held its first community gathering since the previous autumn. Normally impossible during winter due to the difficulty of maintaining heat in larger spaces. The meeting took place in Robert Hutchins' cabin, its dual chimney system keeping 40 people comfortable for 3 hours on a single afternoon's fire. The gathering's purpose was to discuss spring planting strategies. But before it began, Samuel Hendricks, the same man who'd predicted Callahan would be frozen by February, stood and spoke. "I was wrong about Ezra Callahan," he said simply. "We all were, and I'm grateful for it." Callahan, present but characteristically quiet, simply nodded. The revolution was complete. What had been dismissed as madness in October 1878 had become standard practice by March 1881. The timeline from mockery to mastery, 29 months. Today, if you hike through certain areas of Gunnison County, Colorado, you'll find stone foundations that tell this story without words. Dual columns, spaced 6 to 10 feet apart, built from carefully selected sandstone, foundations extending deep into the earth. The cabins themselves are long gone. Log structures decay, roofs collapse, wooden elements return to soil within a century. But stone remembers. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1970s identified 23 double chimney foundations in the Gunnison area dating to 1878 to 1885. Subsequent research traced the design's diffusion into neighboring counties and eventually into Montana, Wyoming, and parts of Idaho. The technique never became universal. It required specific conditions to be worth the extra labor. Areas with plentiful firewood or milder winters didn't justify the construction investment. But in high-altitude, cold climate, wood-scarce environments, Callahan's principle of thermal mass storage became a standard approach. What Ezra Callahan had discovered through intuition and observation, modern building science would later formalize as passive thermal storage, the use of high-mass materials to absorb, store, and slowly release heat energy. Contemporary sustainable architecture uses the same principles. Concrete floors, brick walls, stone features, tram walls. The terminology is modern, but the physics is ancient. Mass heated slowly releases heat slowly. The irony, of course, is that Callahan's design wasn't original. Similar principles appear in Russian masonry heaters, dating to the 1500s, Korean ondol systems, dating to antiquity, and Japanese irori hearths. What Callahan did was rediscover and adapt these principles for frontier American conditions, using locally available materials and construction methods accessible to common settlers. The real innovation wasn't the physics. It was the implementation, making thermal mass storage work within the constraints of 1870s Colorado. Limited tools, harsh conditions, isolated communities, and the necessity of convincing skeptical neighbors that extra labor would yield real returns. The story of Ezra Callahan's double chimney is often framed as a tale of individual genius overcoming collective ignorance. That's too simple. The truth is more nuanced. Callahan had specific knowledge, railroad surveying, exposure to diverse building traditions that his neighbors lacked. His neighbors had different knowledge, local stone quality, weather patterns, woodlot management that he needed to learn. The breakthrough came not from one man's brilliance, but from the integration of different knowledge systems. Marcus Webb wasn't wrong to be skeptical. Skepticism is appropriate when someone proposes an untested design in life or death conditions. What made Webb a good craftsman, and ultimately a better one, was his willingness to revise his position when empirical evidence contradicted his assumptions. James Torrance wasn't special because he believed in Callahan. He was special because he measured results objectively and shared those measurements honestly. Samuel Hedrick's value wasn't in his initial dismissal, but in his eventual public acknowledgement that he'd been wrong. The legacy isn't just thermal mass chimneys. It's the broader lesson about how frontier communities learned, through practical demonstration, empirical measurement, and the willingness to adopt better methods regardless of who developed them. In modern terms, we might call this evidence-based practice. In frontier terms, it was simpler. What works survives. There's a secondary legacy worth noting: the democratization of comfort. Before Callahan's design spread, staying warm through a Colorado winter required either constant labor, feeding fires every 2 hours, or substantial wealth. Enough hire helped to maintain fires around the clock. The double chimney didn't just improve heating efficiency. It made comfortable winter living accessible to common homesteaders. This matters. Technologies that reduce the labor required for basic survival create time and energy for everything else. Education, culture, innovation, community building, simply being human rather than merely surviving. Ezra Callahan died in 1893 at age 67, in the cabin he'd built 15 years earlier. According to local records, he was found at his workbench, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep during a February night. The temperature inside his cabin when neighbors found him the next morning, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, 8 degrees below zero. The fire had been out for at least 10 hours. The stone was still warm. His design outlived him by decades. The principles outlived the designs by centuries. And the lesson outlives us all. Dismissing traditional knowledge or unconventional innovation as primitive or impractical often reveals not the ignorance of those who practice it, but the limitations of those who dismiss it. The next time you see something that doesn't fit conventional wisdom, something that experienced people call impossible or wasteful or insane, remember Ezra Callahan and his double chimneys. Remember that sometimes the madman on the mountain knows something the valley doesn't. And remember that winter, cold and absolute, doesn't care about your assumptions. It only cares about what works. If this story changed how you think about heating, survival, or trusting unconventional wisdom, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten engineering secrets from America's frontier past. Drop a comment telling me, what old technique do you think modern builders have forgotten? Let's learn from the past together.